When I was 8 years old, I moved across the country with my family. It was a really rough time for me. I didn't know it at the time, but I was about to abandon my entire way of life for a completely new one. We were moving at the time from the heart of Los Angeles to suburban Georgia, which if you are from the United States, you'll understand to be somewhat of a culture shock. One of the things I remember best about this transition was the video games I played that summer. My mother was pretty protective, so she kept us indoors by putting video games in front of me and my siblings. When we had moved into our aunt's place where we were staying before we moved to Georgia, she bought us 2 handhelds to keep me and my brother entertained and indoors. An original model Nintendo DS for me, and a Game Boy Advance for my little brother. My mom was making the rounds saying goodbye to some of her closest LA friends, so we would travel around the area. And I think even then she knew we weren't going to be back for a while. One of the people we visited were some of my favorite cousins. Well, they weren't actually cousins, but I didn't know that then. These guys are around our age, and they were family friends who were more into gaming than me and my brother were at the time, which is surprising if you knew us. They were ahead of us in terms of games of the era. I remember being fascinated watching them play classics that I wouldn't get a hold of till years later, like Mario 64 and Donkey Kong 64. That time when we visited them, their current obsession was Pokemon. They were good dudes, and they were always willing to share what they were into with me and my little brother. My mom talked to her friend for so long, so we got a lot of time to hang out with these guys. Then they started introducing us to Pokemon. My only ever experience of Pokemon before this was looking over some other Latino kid's shoulder while he played what I guess was Pokemon Yellow at a laundromat. This is a really faint memory, but I was probably like 6, and I remember being super confused by the gameplay. Why was he walking around in what I thought were spikes? And why would the action cut away every couple of seconds to a boring screen with words and numbers on it? I was super young, and it was still years before I would hear the term RPG for the first time. But now I was 8, and thanks to the graphics on the Game Boy Advance, I understood that I was a kid moving into a new town, and that the professor needed my help, and that I was going to save him from utter peril by using my Trico to tackle the shit out of a Poochyena. And just as I defeated May with my Trico, my mom told us that we're leaving. I hadn't realized it, but it had gotten dark outside. I was sad to leave behind my Trico in this magical world of Pokemon that I'd just been introduced to by our friends. But this is just the way of life when you're young and at the whim of adults. Surprisingly though, these guys let us actually borrow 2 of the Pokemon games that they had, as long as we returned them before we left LA. The only stipulation was that we couldn't save in either of the games, which kinda sucks. But ironically, me and my brother were well accustomed to playing games without saving, as we had a GameCube for years without a freaking memory card. But that's another story. Our summer then went from being dull and boring to kind of full of intrigue and wonder. Even though we couldn't save, we played through the first couple hours of Pokemon Ruby and Emerald over and over again. It sounds insane now, but at the time, that is really just how we played video games. Eventually, of course, we had to move, so we returned the games, and my mom returned the DS and the Game Boy to GameStop. I guess the whole point of those things was just to keep us from complaining before we moved to Georgia while there was nothing to do. And that was the end of our Pokemon journey, as well as the end of our Los Angeles journey. A plane ride later, me and my brother were suddenly in cicada-screeching woods of the suburban South. And after that, my mom heard no end to our annoying whining for a Nintendo DS and Pokemon. There was no doubt that we were spoiled and annoying children, and she caved eventually. I couldn't have been older than 9 when I finally got to start my own file on Pokemon Ruby, and honestly, I still remember that day pretty well. She got us both a white DS Lite and a copy of Ruby for me and a copy of Emerald for my younger brother. All was right in the world. The rest is history. Pokemon was the perfect game for me. We didn't get new games all that often, and the addictive Pocket Monster JRPG craze was hours and hours of fun, with little pixelated best friends that I began to love as if they really existed. There was no reversing it at this point. I was on my way to becoming a fucking nerd. And my brother and me became totally devoted to this series that would put its mainstay releases on cheaper handhelds and $40 cartridges for the rest of the decade. It's hard to understate the impact that Pokemon had on me. It was a very clear moment when my love for video games changed from my favorite pastime to a total obsession, I was a pretty sheltered kid, and while I loved Super Mario Sunshine and some of the other random games we had on our GameCube, you can only have so much fun on that console without a memory card. At the time, Pokemon offered me a whole world to explore and a save file I could call completely my own. Anyone who shares a console with their sibling will know why this is important. It's funny to think how fitting the story of a game starting your player character as moving into a completely new region was so similar to what me and my brother were going through at the time. Why this whole story? Well, a new Pokemon game came out last year and I thought I'd share my thoughts on it as a fan of the series through the years. I got this game for Christmas and I was overjoyed to open it. My 21-year-old ass getting psyched for a Pokemon game for Christmas. Go figure. So, what's new with Pokemon on the Switch? Well, I am definitely gonna steal something my brothers say, only because it's so true. They really aren't making these games for people like me and him anymore. The thing is, Pokemon has again become a new thing thanks to the mobile game Pokemon Go craze, and Game Freak is really having some kind of minor identity crisis trying to figure out what Pokemon games look like in the post-Pokemon Go world. But here's a quick summary. This game has a combat system that would still work on a Game Boy, and it runs on a console that can play Skyrim now. What the fuck? Unfortunately, it seems, as my brother has suggested, that this game really hits home with the Instagram influencer and little kid crowd. You can see the credits in this game in like 20 hours if you know how to play an RPG, and that's just a shame. The game's difficulty and content is just lacking, and the story is laughably bad, even for a Pokemon game, which is just sad. But to Game Freak's credit, the presentation is pretty good, and honestly I think that the Wild area, which is an open world space with randomly rotating Pokemon and items, has an almost Breath of the Wild feel to it. There's like a grand possibility to what can happen in there, especially because of the randomly generated nature of it. But when you first gain access to it in the main story, it's a joy to explore, and you can even nab some rare items and like rare Pokemon if you know what you're doing. The shame is that they don't utilize it nearly enough in the main story. You're only really required to go into it like 4 times, and by the second half of the game you're so over-leveled that there's no incentive to go in there anyways. But the soundtrack has some pretty good tracks. So in the end, Pokemon still holds up as a pretty novel RPG that anyone can pick up and play, but the lack of good story content makes its newest installment feel more like a quick cash-in on the brand than a unique game with its own identity to set it apart in a history of this cherished franchise. I'll probably be coming back to these games for years, just out of fondness that I talked about in the first half of this review. But it's just a shame to see them taking this turn. Maybe I've learned everything I can from Pokemon, which helped me cope with moving into a completely new state, and helped me even make new friends when I was a little kid. Or maybe new Pokemon just sucks.